Do you believe life-changing stories can happen in the quietest places? In this video, discover how James, a lonely Kansas farmer, found hope through an abandoned baby and his loyal dog, Rex. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Let's get started. The golden hues of the Kansas wheat fields stretched endlessly, rippling under the soft morning breeze like a sea of liquid sunlight. James Walker, a man of 35, stood silently on the creaking wooden porch of his modest farmhouse, a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands. His frame was tall and sturdy, shaped by years of hard labor, yet his slouched shoulders and tired blue eyes revealed the weight of a grief he couldn't escape. James had lived alone on this farm for the past 3 years, ever since cancer had taken his wife, Emily. She had been the light of his life, a vivacious woman with a laugh that could fill even the vast emptiness of the Kansas plains. Now, her absence haunted every corner of the farmhouse. From the faded floral curtains she had sewn herself to the framed photographs gathering dust on the mantel. For James, the days had become a monotonous blur. He woke before dawn, worked the fields from sunup to sundown, and collapsed into bed with a weariness that was more emotional than physical. The farm was his refuge, a place where he could bury himself in the relentless demands of the land and avoid confronting the void Emily had left behind. His only companion was Rex, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a coat as black as the Kansas night. Rex was more than a dog to James. He was a lifeline. The two shared an unspoken bond forged through shared solitude. Every morning, Rex would follow James to the barn, his ears perked and his tail wagging, as if trying to remind his owner that there was still joy to be found, even in the smallest moments. The farmhouse itself was simple but functional, a sturdy structure built to withstand the unpredictable weather of the Midwest. Inside, it was a mix of old and new. The kitchen, with its outdated linoleum floors and mismatched cabinets, bore signs of Emily's touch. A jar of dried lavender here, a handwritten recipe card tacked to the fridge there. The living room was sparsely furnished, with a well-worn recliner and a coffee table littered with unopened letters and farming catalogs. On this particular morning, James leaned against the porch railing, letting the cool air wash over him. The distant hum of a tractor echoed across the plains, a reminder that life around him carried on, indifferent to his pain. He sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the rising sun met the rolling fields. It was a beautiful scene, but to James, it felt empty. "Rex, come on," he called, his voice rough from disuse. The dog bounded up the porch steps, his bright eyes full of energy. "We've got work to do." Rex barked in response, as if to say, "Let's get to it." Together, they headed toward the barn, where the tools of James's trade awaited him. A battered John Deere tractor, a collection of rusted tools, and the ever-present scent of hay and earth. The barn was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where James felt a semblance of control amidst the chaos of his emotions. As James prepped the tractor for the day's work, Rex wandered off, sniffing at the edges of the barn and chasing the occasional field mouse. The dog's antics brought a faint smile to James's lips, a rare expression of warmth in a face that had grown accustomed to stoicism. James often thought about leaving the farm, selling it to someone who could truly care for it, someone who hadn't lost their reason for living. But then he'd think of Emily, of how much she had loved this place, how they had dreamed of raising a family here. Letting it go felt like letting go of her, and James wasn't ready for that. Not yet. As the morning stretched into midday, the sun climbed higher, and James wiped the sweat from his brow, staring out at the fields he had tended for years. This land had seen his greatest joys and his deepest sorrows. It had been a witness to his love for Emily and now bore silent testimony to his grief. For James, the farm was both a blessing and a curse. It gave him purpose, but also tethered him to memories he couldn't escape. And yet, amidst the pain, there was a quiet resilience in the way he continued to rise each day, to work the fields, to care for Rex. It was as if, deep down, he knew that life, like the wheat he harvested, had seasons, and perhaps, one day, his season of sorrow would give way to something new. Unbeknownst to James, that day was closer than he thought. Hidden within the golden expanse of his fields and the familiar routine of his farm, life was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loss, love, and the power of new beginnings. James Walker's life revolved around the same unchanging rhythm. Each day began before dawn, the faint chirping of crickets giving way to the rustle of wind through the endless fields of wheat. While most would marvel at the beauty of the Kansas landscape, James saw it as a backdrop to his solitude, a quiet stage where he played the role of a man simply going through the motions. His farmhouse sat on a modest plot of land, surrounded by miles of golden fields. The nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away, in the small town of Cottonwood, with its single diner, post office, and grain elevator, was a 30-minute drive down a dusty, unpaved road. James rarely ventured into town, making only the occasional trip for supplies or to drop off his harvest at the co-op. The people in Cottonwood knew James, but didn't know him well. To them, he was the quiet farmer who kept to himself, a man whose life seemed as sturdy and straightforward as his weathered barn. But those who remembered the days when Emily was alive knew there had been a time when James smiled easily, when his laughter echoed through the aisles of the local hardware store. That man was gone, buried alongside his wife. James avoided social interactions whenever possible. Invitations to community events were politely declined, and small talk with the cashiers at the general store was kept to a minimum. Even the workers who helped during the harvest understood that James preferred silence over camaraderie. The rare moments of connection he allowed were reserved for Rex, the only creature who seemed to truly understand him. The farmhouse, though well-maintained, bore the signs of James's isolation. The porch swing where he and Emily had once spent warm summer evenings now sat still and unused. Inside, the dining table was set for one, a constant reminder of the emptiness that had taken over his life. The fridge held little more than beer, eggs, and leftovers, and the TV in the living room was rarely turned on. Despite the isolation, James found solace in his work. The fields demanded his attention, their needs unchanging and predictable. He knew when to plant, when to water, and when to harvest. The rhythm of the seasons gave him a sense of purpose, a way to fill the hours and keep his mind from wandering to memories he couldn't bear to relive. On most days, Rex followed him from task to task, a silent companion who never left his side. The German Shepherd had an uncanny ability to sense James's moods, nuzzling his hand when the weight of his grief became too much to bear. Sometimes, James would sit on the steps of the barn after a long day, scratching behind Rex's ears as the sun dipped below the horizon. "You're the only one who gets it, aren't you, boy?" James would say, his voice rough but soft. Rex would respond with a wag of his tail and a steady gaze, as if to say, "I'm here. I always will be." The workers who occasionally came to the farm admired Rex's loyalty, but often whispered among themselves about James's reclusive nature. "He's not unfriendly," one of them had remarked to another, "just broken." And in truth, that was how James felt most days, like a man trying to piece together a life that no longer fit. Even when he ventured into town, James kept his interactions brief. At the diner, where Emily used to insist on ordering pie after every meal, he now ordered coffee to go. At the post office, he nodded politely to the clerk but avoided lingering. The people of Cottonwood respected his boundaries, though they often exchanged quiet looks of pity when he passed by. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a part of James that longed for something more. On rare occasions, he found himself staring at the horizon, wondering if life could ever feel full again. He thought about Emily often, her laugh, the way she hummed while cooking, the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about starting a family. But those thoughts were always followed by a wave of guilt, as if moving forward would somehow betray her memory. Rex was the only thing keeping James tethered to the world. The dog's boundless energy and unwavering devotion reminded him that not all was lost. But even Rex couldn't fill the void completely. James's world, for all its beauty, felt empty. It was in this quiet, unchanging existence that James lived, day after day, year after year. He had resigned himself to the belief that this was all life had left to offer, a simple, solitary routine. But fate had other plans, and soon, The isolation that James had come to accept would be shattered in ways he could never have imagined. The morning started like any other. The Kansas sky stretched endlessly above James's farm, painted in hues of soft lavender and gold as the sun rose. James walked toward the barn, Rex trotting close beside him, his tail wagging lazily. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the air, blending with the rhythmic crunch of James's boots against the dirt path. As James approached the barn, he noticed Rex's ears perk up sharply. The dog froze mid-step, his nose twitching, and let out a low growl. James stopped, following Rex's gaze toward the edge of the barn, where the sunlight barely kissed the shadowy corners of the wooden structure. "What is it, boy?" James asked, his voice gruff but curious. Rex barked once, sharp, urgent, and bounded toward the barn, his paws kicking up small clouds of dust. James frowned. Rex was usually calm, his demeanor steady and measured. This was different. The urgency in the dog's bark sent a chill down James's spine. He followed quickly, his pulse quickening as he reached the barn doors. Rex was there, standing by an old stack of hay bales, barking insistently. He looked back at James, his intelligent brown eyes full of an urgency that couldn't be ignored. James moved closer, the faint sound of rustling reaching his ears. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something alive. "Rex, move," James commanded, stepping forward. The dog backed away but kept his eyes fixed on the pile of hay. James crouched down, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled at the loose bales. His breath caught as he uncovered the source of the sound. There, nestled in a makeshift hollow between the hay and the barn wall, was a baby. A baby. James's mind reeled, struggling to process what he was seeing. The infant was wrapped in a thin, worn blanket, its tiny face red and scrunched as it let out a weak cry. "Jesus Christ," James muttered under his breath. He leaned closer, his heart pounding. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old, its fragile form shivering despite the warmth of the morning. For a moment, James was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. His hands hovered awkwardly over the child as if afraid to touch it. Rex whined softly, nudging James with his nose as if urging him to act. That small gesture snapped James out of his stupor. He carefully scooped the baby into his arms, cradling the tiny body against his chest. The baby's cries softened as it felt the warmth of his touch, its small fingers curling instinctively against his shirt. "Where the hell did you come from?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. He glanced around the barn, half expecting someone to appear and claim the child. But there was no one, just the vast emptiness of the fields and the gentle rustle of the wheat in the breeze. Carrying the baby, James hurried back to the farmhouse, Rex trotting close beside him. His mind raced with questions. Who had left the child here? Why? And how long had it been out there, vulnerable to the elements? The thought made his stomach churn. Inside the house, James carefully laid the baby on the couch, grabbing an old quilt to wrap around it. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to think clearly. His first instinct was to call the sheriff's office, but something stopped him. The baby looked healthy, but its presence in such a remote location felt deliberate, like someone had wanted it to be found, but not by just anyone. Rex sat beside the couch, his eyes fixed on the baby. The dog's usual playfulness was replaced with an air of solemnity, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. James knelt beside him, placing a hand on his thick fur. "What do we do, boy?" he murmured, his voice heavy with uncertainty. Rex let out a soft woof, his tail thumping once against the floor. It was as if the dog was saying, "We figure it out. Together." James stood and grabbed his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. He hesitated for a long moment before dialing the sheriff's office. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Sheriff Tucker speaking." "Hey, Mike, it's James," he said, his voice steady but tense. "I've got a situation here. You'd better come out to the farm." "What kind of situation?" Mike asked, his tone immediately serious. James glanced back at the baby, who had drifted into a fitful sleep. "The kind that involves a baby. Found it in the barn this morning." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Mike said finally. As James hung up, He looked down at the tiny bundle on his couch. In all his years on the farm, he had never encountered anything like this. The quiet, predictable life he had built for himself was unraveling, and he had no idea what was coming next. But deep down, as he watched Rex lie protectively beside the baby, James felt something stir, a flicker of purpose, of hope. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of something bigger than himself. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change forever. The sound of a car engine hummed faintly in the distance, carried across the Kansas plains by the midday breeze. James glanced out the window of his farmhouse, his brow furrowed. Sheriff Mike Tucker had already come and gone, promising to alert local agencies about the baby and investigate its origins. But this sound wasn't Mike's old patrol car. It was something else. Rex, who had been lying beside the couch where the baby now slept peacefully, perked up. The dog's ears stood tall, and he let out a low growl. James stepped onto the porch, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floorboards, just as an old sedan rolled into view. Dust swirled behind the vehicle as it pulled to a stop near the barn. The driver's door creaked open, and a woman emerged. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, with disheveled brown hair that hung limply around her pale, freckled face. Her clothes were wrinkled and covered in dust, and the exhaustion etched into her features was unmistakable. She clutched a small purse against her chest as if it were her lifeline. James didn't move, watching her warily as she approached the porch. "Can I help you?" he called, his voice firm but not unkind. The woman stopped a few feet away, her eyes darting nervously between James and Rex, who stood at his side, tail rigid and lips curled slightly in a protective snarl. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm looking for my baby. Someone said there was a baby found here." James's chest tightened. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it wasn't this. He studied her closely, noting the trembling in her hands and the way her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She didn't seem dangerous. If anything, she looked like she was barely holding herself together. "Who are you?" he asked cautiously. "My name is Sarah," she replied, her voice breaking. "Please, is my baby here?" James hesitated. Sheriff Tucker had warned him not to jump to conclusions, to let the authorities handle the situation. But something in Sarah's demeanor tugged at him, an unmistakable desperation that didn't feel fabricated. "What's the baby's name?" he asked, testing her. "Lily," she said immediately, her lips quivering. "Her name is Lily." The name hit James like a punch to the gut. He thought of Emily, of how they had planned to name their first child Lily, a name that had gone unspoken in the years since her passing. His grip on the porch railing tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. "She's inside," he said finally, stepping aside to let Sarah onto the porch. "But if you're telling me the truth, you've got some explaining to do." Sarah nodded, her face crumpling with relief. She climbed the steps, her movements slow and unsteady, and followed James into the house. Rex trotted behind them, his watchful eyes never leaving her. When Sarah saw the baby sleeping soundly on the couch, she let out a choked sob and sank to her knees. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, reaching out to touch the tiny hand that peeked out from the quilt. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she cradled the baby's hand against her lips. James crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Start talking," he said, his voice low but firm. "How did your baby end up in my barn?" Sarah wiped her eyes, her breath hitching. I had no choice," she began. "My husband, Richard, he's a powerful man, controlling, abusive. When I found out I was pregnant, he told me I couldn't keep the baby, said it would ruin his image." Her voice cracked, and she paused to steady herself. "I ran," she continued. "I left in the middle of the night with nothing but this." She gestured to her purse. "I thought I could make it somewhere safe, but he found me. His men were looking for me everywhere. I had to hide Lily somewhere I thought she'd be found quickly. I didn't know what else to do." James's expression softened slightly, but his skepticism lingered. "So you just left her? Alone in a barn?" "I didn't want to," Sarah exclaimed, her voice rising. "I hated myself for it. But it was either that, or let him take her. I knew if I didn't hide her, he'd take her away and I might never see her again. James studied her, his heart conflicted. He could see the pain and fear in her eyes, but the situation was too complicated to take at face value. He had questions, plenty of them, but before he could speak, Sarah looked up at him, her expression pleading. "Please," she said. "I just want to keep her safe. I'll leave if I have to, but I can't go back to him. Not after everything he's done." Rex, who had been sitting quietly, walked over to Sarah and nudged her arm gently with his nose. James watched, surprised. Rex didn't trust strangers easily, but it seemed he had already decided that Sarah wasn't a threat. James sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right," he said reluctantly. "You can stay for now, but I'm calling Sheriff Tucker. If you're lying to me, I swear." "I'm not," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm despite the tears. "I promise I'm not lying." James nodded, though his doubts lingered. As he reached for his phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than any of them. The farmhouse was quiet except for the faint hum of the wind brushing against the windows and the soft coos of Lily as she lay on the couch. Sarah sat in a worn kitchen chair, clutching a mug of tea James had reluctantly made for her. She looked smaller now, sitting under the dim kitchen light, her shoulders hunched and her eyes downcast. Rex lay at her feet, his loyalty already evident as he stayed close to her side. James leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. He had called Sheriff Tucker, who agreed to come by the next morning to sort things out. But for now, James needed answers. The story Sarah had started to tell was incomplete, and he wasn't the type to let details slip by unnoticed. "All right, Sarah," James said, his tone firm but measured. "You've got my attention. Now tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she cupped the mug. She glanced at Lily, her gaze softening, before taking a deep breath. "I met Richard when I was 22, she began, her voice quiet. "He was charming, successful, everything a girl like me thought she wanted. He swept me off my feet so fast I didn't see the red flags." James frowned but didn't interrupt. He could see the pain etched into her face as she spoke, her words heavy with regret. "At first, he was sweet," Sarah continued. "He bought me gifts, took me to fancy places. He said he loved me, that he'd give me the world. And I believed him." Her voice faltered, and she shook her head. "But after we got married, everything changed." She paused, her hands tightening around the mug. James noticed a faint bruise on her wrist, half hidden by the sleeve of her sweater. "He controlled everything, what I wore, who I talked to, where I went. And if I stepped out of line, he'd—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. "He'd hurt you," James said quietly, finishing the sentence she couldn't. Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought I could handle it," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought maybe if I did everything right, he'd stop. But it only got worse. And then, when I found out I was pregnant," she let out a bitter laugh, her tears spilling over. "He was furious. Said I was trying to trap him, that a baby would ruin his image as a successful, powerful man. He wanted me to get rid of her." James's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man prone to strong displays of emotion, but the idea of someone treating a child, let alone their own flesh and blood, as an inconvenience made his stomach churn. "And when you refused?" he asked. Sarah's hands shook as she set the mug down. "He locked me in the house, took my phone, cut off my credit cards. He said if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd make me regret it." She looked up at James, her eyes filled with desperation. "I couldn't let him hurt her. So I waited until he was away on a business trip, packed what little I could carry and ran." James let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "That's a hell of a risk to take." "It didn't feel like I had a choice," Sarah said. "I didn't know where to go. I just drove as far as I could. But Richard has people everywhere. He's got money, connections. I couldn't stay in one place too long. I ran out of money, and when I realized they were close, I had to leave Lily somewhere safe. I prayed someone kind would find her before they did." James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't doubt that Sarah was telling the truth, Her fear was too raw, her story too detailed to be a fabrication. But that didn't make the situation any less complicated. "Does he know where you are now?" James asked, his voice calm but firm. Sarah shook her head. "I don't think so. I've been careful, but he has ways of finding things out." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked at Lily, now sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the storm surrounding her. "You've put me in a hell of a spot. You know that?" "I know," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm sorry. I didn't mean to drag you into this, but I didn't know where else to go." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then James spoke, his tone softer than before. "Well, you're here now, and as long as you're under my roof, no one's going to lay a hand on you or that baby. You have my word." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you." Rex let out a low woof, as if echoing James's sentiment. The tension in the room eased slightly, but James knew this was only the beginning. Richard wasn't the kind of man to give up easily, and if he came looking for Sarah, James would need to be ready. As he turned off the kitchen light and headed for the stairs, James glanced back at Sarah and Lily one last time. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The quiet life he had built for himself was gone, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the farmhouse windows, casting a warm glow on the rustic wooden floors. James was up early, as always, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. As he stood by the counter, staring out at the fields, he couldn't help but glance toward the living room. There, on the couch, Sarah sat with Lily in her lap, gently rocking the baby while Rex sat dutifully at her feet. The sight was strangely domestic, almost peaceful, but James couldn't shake the unease that lingered. His life had been upended in less than 24 hours, and he wasn't entirely sure how to navigate this new reality. Rex, however, had no such reservations. The German Shepherd had taken to Sarah and Lily almost instantly, a change that surprised James. Rex was protective by nature, but he had always been cautious around strangers. Now, as Sarah spoke softly to Lily, Rex rested his head on her knee, his dark eyes watching the baby with a mix of curiosity and devotion. "You've got a friend there," James said, breaking the silence as he walked into the room with 2 mugs of coffee. He set one on the table in front of Sarah. She looked up at him with a small, grateful smile. "He's amazing," she said, stroking Rex's head. "I've never seen a dog like him. It's like he knows, like he understands." James nodded, leaning against the arm of the couch. "Rex is smart. Smarter than most people I know." He glanced at the dog, who wagged his tail once in acknowledgement. "He can read people better than I can, too. If he trusts you, that says something." Sarah smiled faintly, her hand brushing against Rex's fur. "He's the first thing that's made me feel safe in a long time." James didn't respond, but her words lingered in his mind. He had always seen Rex as his protector, his silent partner in the isolated life he'd built. Seeing the dog extend that same loyalty to Sarah and Lily stirred something unexpected in him. A flicker of hope, maybe, or the faintest sense of purpose. Later that morning, while James worked in the fields, Sarah carried Lily out onto the porch. She sat on the steps, letting the baby rest against her shoulder as she looked out at the vast expanse of wheat swaying in the breeze. Rex followed, settling down beside her, his ears alert as he scanned the horizon. "You're watching over us, aren't you?" Sarah said softly, glancing at the dog. Rex's ears perked up, and he let out a low, affirmative woof. She chuckled, the sound light and almost unfamiliar to her after so many weeks of fear and uncertainty. As the hours passed, Sarah grew more comfortable around the farm, though her nervous glances toward the road betrayed her lingering anxiety. Rex stayed close to her and Lily, his presence a constant reassurance. When Lily cried, Rex would nuzzle her gently, his soft whines seeming to calm the baby in a way nothing else could. By the time James returned from the fields, sweat-soaked and tired, he found Sarah in the yard with Lily in her arms and Rex standing guard. She was humming softly, a simple lullaby that drifted on the breeze. For a moment, James paused, taking in the scene. It was a stark contrast to the silence that had dominated his life for so long, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. "You're settling in," he said, walking over to her. His tone was neutral, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. Sarah looked up, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I'm trying," she admitted. "It's peaceful here. For the first time, I don't feel like I have to look over my shoulder every second." James nodded, glancing at Rex. The dog stood between them, his posture relaxed but alert. "Rex seems to think you belong here," he said. "That's not something I've seen before." Sarah smiled faintly. "He's been a blessing. I don't know what I would have done without him. Or you." James shifted uncomfortably, not used to receiving gratitude. "Just doing what anyone would have done," he muttered. "But Rex, he's something special." Over the next few days, the bond between Rex, Sarah, and Lily only grew stronger. The dog followed Sarah everywhere she went, his loyalty unwavering. He seemed to sense her fear, her vulnerability, and responded with a quiet, steadfast presence that gave her the courage to keep going. For Lily, Rex became a source of endless fascination. The baby would giggle and reach for his ears, and Rex would patiently sit still, his tail wagging as if he understood that she was the most important thing in the world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Sarah sat on the porch steps with Lily asleep in her arms. James joined her, sitting a few feet away with Rex lying between them. "Thank you," Sarah said suddenly, her voice soft but sincere. James looked at her, his expression unreadable. "For what?" "For letting us stay," she said. "For trusting me. I know I brought a lot of trouble to your door." James was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "You didn't bring the trouble," he said. "But you're not alone in facing it anymore." Sarah blinked back tears, her grip on Lily tightening slightly. "That means more than I can say." James nodded, his gaze shifting to the fields. "We'll figure this out. All of it." As the stars began to appear in the vast Kansas sky, the three of them, James, Sarah, and Rex, sat together in the quiet, each of them finding a small measure of peace in the presence of the others. For the first time in years, the farmhouse felt less like a place of solitude and more like the beginnings of a home. The stillness of the Kansas plains was deceptive. It stretched out for miles, serene and undisturbed, but James Walker couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was on its way. He could sense it in the tension in Sarah's voice whenever she asked if he had seen anything unusual. He could see it in the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. Even Rex seemed more on edge than usual, his ears constantly swiveling toward the faintest sound. It was late afternoon when James first noticed the unfamiliar vehicle approaching. A sleek black SUV kicked up a plume of dust as it sped down the dirt road toward the farmhouse. James had seen enough movies to know what a car like that usually meant: money and power. Neither were things he wanted near his farm. From his spot on the porch, James stood, narrowing his eyes as the vehicle rolled to a stop just outside the gate. Rex was already at his side, growling low in his throat, his body tense. Sarah appeared at the doorway, Lily cradled in her arms, her face pale as she caught sight of the car. "Is it him?" James asked, his voice sharp. Sarah swallowed hard, clutching Lily closer. "It's Richard." "I know it is." James nodded, his jaw tightening. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I say it's safe." Sarah hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. "James, you don't know what he's capable of." "I know enough," James replied. He glanced at Rex, giving the dog a silent signal. "Go." Rex bolted down the steps, his barks echoing across the field as he positioned himself between the SUV and the farmhouse. James followed, his boots crunching against the dirt as he approached the car, his expression cold and unyielding. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. Richard Kingston looked every bit the part of the powerful businessman Sarah had described. He was tall, with perfectly styled dark hair, and a tailored suit that looked absurdly out of place in the middle of a wheat field. His sunglasses reflected the sunlight, hiding his eyes, but the smirk on his face was enough to make James's blood boil. "Well," Richard drawled, his voice smooth and confident, "this must be the famous James Walker." I've heard a lot about you. James didn't respond. He simply stood there, arms crossed, his stance firm. Rex growled again, inching closer to Richard, who glanced down at the dog with a faint sneer. You might want to call off your mutt, Richard said. Wouldn't want anyone to get hurt. Rex doesn't take kindly to threats, James said evenly. And neither do I. What do you want? Richard's smirk widened. I think you know exactly what I want. My wife and my child. They don't belong here, Walker. They belong with me. James took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. Your wife and your child are here because you made them run. You don't get to play the victim. Richard chuckled, the sound cold and calculated. You've got this whole knight in shining armor thing going on, don't you? But let me tell you something, Walker. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I don't lose. Ever. Sounds like a personal problem, James shot back. But you're not getting anywhere near them. Richard's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flash of irritation. He took a step closer, his polished shoes kicking up dust. Do you really think you can stop me? I could bury you and this whole damn farm with one phone call. James didn't flinch. You can try. But out here, it's a long way to the nearest courthouse. By the time anyone gets here, Rex and I will make sure you regret it. The two men stood face to face, the tension thick in the air. Behind James, Rex barked loudly, his stance aggressive and unyielding. Richard's hand twitched, but he seemed to think better of whatever he had been planning. You're making a mistake, Richard said finally, his voice low and threatening. You have no idea how far I'll go to get what's mine. James took another step forward, his eyes locking with Richard's. And you have no idea how far I'll go to protect them. Richard stared at him for a long moment before finally stepping back. This isn't over, he said, his smirk returning as he climbed back into the SUV. Not by a long shot. James watched as the car sped away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Rex stayed at his heel, his growls quieting as the dust settled. Slowly, James turned and walked back to the house, his heart pounding. Sarah was waiting just inside the door, her face pale. What did he say? She asked, her voice trembling. James shook his head. He said it's not over. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but James stepped closer, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Let him come, he said firmly. We'll be ready. As Sarah nodded, a spark of determination flickering in her gaze, Rex sat at their feet, his presence a constant reminder that no matter what came next, they weren't facing it alone. The farmhouse was heavy with silence after Richard's departure. The golden light of late afternoon filtered through the windows, but the warmth of the sun did little to dispel the tension that lingered in the air. Sarah sat on the worn couch with Lily cradled against her chest, her expression a mixture of fear and exhaustion. James stood by the window, his broad shoulders stiff as he stared out at the endless expanse of wheat fields. Rex lay at his feet, his ears perked and his eyes sharp, ready for any sign of danger. James's mind was racing. Richard's threats weren't hollow. He could feel it in the man's demeanor, the way he exuded power and control. This wasn't a battle James could win with sheer willpower alone. He needed a plan, and he needed help. He turned to Sarah, his voice low but steady. We can't wait for him to make the next move. If Richard comes back, it won't be to talk. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. What are we supposed to do? He has money, connections. I can't fight him. You're not fighting him alone, James said firmly. He grabbed his phone from the counter and began dialing. I know someone who can help. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Walker, it's been a while. What's going on? Mike, James said, relief flooding his voice at the sound of Sheriff Tucker's gruff tone. I need your help. It's serious. What kind of serious? Mike asked, his voice immediately alert. James glanced at Sarah, who was watching him intently. The kind where a man like Richard Kingston shows up on your doorstep, threatening to take a woman and her child. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Kingston? As in the billionaire from New York? You've got his wife and kid at your place? They showed up on my farm, running from him, James explained. She says he's abusive, and from the way he acted today, I believe her. He's not going to let this go, Mike. Sheriff Tucker sighed heavily. All right. I'll be out there first thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, keep your doors locked and your rifle handy. If Kingston shows up again, don't try to handle him alone. James nodded, even though Mike couldn't see him. Got it. Thanks, Mike. After hanging up, James turned to Sarah. Sheriff Tucker will be here in the morning. He's a good man, and he'll help us figure out the next steps. Sarah nodded, her grip on Lily tightening. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. James's expression softened slightly. You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what anyone decent would do. But deep down, James knew this wasn't something just anyone would take on. Protecting Sarah and Lily was a choice, one he had made with no hesitation, even knowing the risks. For years, he had lived in isolation, focused only on his own pain and survival. Now, for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to fight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James walked out to the barn with Rex at his side. The dog stayed close, his ears swiveling at every rustle of the wheat fields. James opened the barn door, stepping inside to check the locks on the old hunting rifle he kept mounted on the wall. He wasn't looking for trouble, but if it came to his door, he would be ready. Rex, James said, glancing down at the dog. You keep watch tonight, all right? Rex let out a soft woof, his tail wagging slightly. James knelt down, scratching behind the dog's ears. Good boy. I don't know what I'd do without you. As they headed back to the house, James's thoughts returned to Sarah and Lily. The image of Richard's smug face lingered in his mind, fueling a quiet but growing resolve. This was his land, his home, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him, or harm the people under his roof. Back inside, Sarah had put Lily to bed in a makeshift crib James had fashioned from an old wooden box and some blankets. She sat at the kitchen table, staring down at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. James joined her, sitting across from her with his own mug of coffee. Tell me about him, James said after a moment. What else do I need to know about Richard? Sarah hesitated, then took a deep breath. He's relentless. When he wants something, he doesn't stop until he gets it. He's got money, lawyers, and people who will do anything he asks without question. He'll use all of that to make sure I don't get away. James nodded, his jaw tightening. Good to know. And what about you? Is there anyone you trust? Family? Friends? Sarah shook her head. Not anymore. Richard made sure of that. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he considered their options. Well, you've got me and Rex now, he said. And Sheriff Tucker. That's a start. Sarah managed a small smile, her eyes glistening with tears. I don't deserve this, she said quietly. After everything I've been through, I didn't think anyone would help me. James met her gaze, his voice steady. Everyone deserves a second chance. And as long as you're here, you're under my protection. We'll figure this out. Rex let out a soft bark from his spot by the door, as if adding his own reassurance. Sarah laughed softly, a sound that felt almost foreign to her after so much fear. For the first time in years, the farmhouse didn't feel like a place of solitude. It felt like a fortress, strong, safe, and ready to weather whatever storm was coming. The night passed in a tense stillness, the air thick with anticipation. Every creak of the farmhouse seemed louder than usual, every rustle of the wheat fields outside sending James to glance toward the windows. Rex, ever watchful, patrolled between the front door and the living room where Sarah sat cradling Lily. Sheriff Tucker's promise to come in the morning felt a lifetime away. By the time dawn broke, the pale light of the sun filtered through the horizon, casting long shadows across the wheat fields. James had barely slept, his rifle resting by the front door. Rex sat at his feet, his ears twitching at the faint sounds of the early morning. Sarah had finally dozed off on the couch, Lily snug in her arms. James was about to head out to check the perimeter of the property when the distant sound of tires crunching on gravel snapped him to attention. He stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle. Rex let out a low growl, his body tensing as he moved to the window. James followed, peering out through the curtain. Another black SUV was coming up the road, followed closely by a second vehicle. James cursed under his breath. This wasn't the sheriff. This was Richard. Sarah, James said sharply, his voice low but urgent. Sarah stirred, blinking groggily. He's here. Her face drained of color as she sat upright, clutching Lily tighter. What do we do? James grabbed the rifle and moved toward the door, motioning for Sarah to stay put. You stay inside. Lock the doors. Keep the lights off. Don't come out unless I tell you. What about you? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I'll handle it, James said firmly, his gaze locking with hers. Trust me. Sarah hesitated, then nodded, her arms tightening around Lily. James gave her a reassuring nod before stepping outside, Rex close at his heels. The SUVs came to a stop just outside the fence line. Richard stepped out first, dressed in a tailored gray suit that seemed absurdly out of place in the middle of rural Kansas. Behind him, two burly men in black suits emerged, their expressions hard and menacing. Walker, Richard called, his voice dripping with confidence. I told you this wasn't over. James stood his ground, the rifle resting in the crook of his arm. You're trespassing, he said coolly. Turn around and leave. Richard smirked, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel as he approached. You're in no position to be giving orders. I've come to take what's mine, my wife and my daughter. James's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. They're not yours, not anymore. And you're not setting foot on this property. Richard's smirk faltered, replaced by a glint of anger in his eyes. You think you can stop me? Look around, Walker. You're outnumbered. Do yourself a favor and step aside. James glanced at the two men behind Richard, their hands resting near the holsters at their hips. He tightened his grip on the rifle. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched. You take one step past that fence and you'll regret it. The tension crackled in the air like a live wire. Richard glanced at his men, giving them a subtle nod. One of them stepped forward, his hand moving to draw a weapon. But before he could, a deafening bark echoed through the air. Rex lunged forward, snarling, his sharp teeth bared. Call off the dog. Richard snapped, taking a step back. James didn't move. I warned you. Rex stopped just short of the man, his growls reverberating through the morning air. The man froze, his hand hovering over his weapon, clearly unwilling to test the German shepherd's ferocity. Richard glared at James, his confidence faltering. This is how you want to play it? Richard said, his voice cold. Fine. But when this is over, you'll wish you had cooperated. At that moment, the distant wail of a siren cut through the air, growing louder with each passing second. Richard's head snapped toward the sound, his expression darkening. James allowed himself a small, grim smile. Looks like the cavalry's here, he said. The sheriff's car pulled into view, kicking up a cloud of dust as it skidded to a stop. Sheriff Tucker stepped out, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Kingston, he called, his voice booming. This is Sheriff Tucker. You and your men are trespassing on private property. Step away from the fence and put your hands where I can see them. Richard's jaw clenched, but he raised his hands, motioning for his men to do the same. This isn't over, he said through gritted teeth, glaring at James. It is for now, James replied, his tone steady. Now get off my land. Sheriff Tucker approached, his deputies disarming Richard's men and escorting them back to their vehicles. Richard cast one last venomous look at James before climbing into the SUV. The vehicles roared to life and sped off, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Tucker turned to James, his expression serious. You okay? James nodded. Thanks for getting here when you did. Tucker tipped his hat. Don't thank me yet. Men like Kingston don't back down easily. You'll need to be careful. James glanced back at the farmhouse, where Sarah stood in the doorway, holding Lily close. Rex trotted over to her, his tail wagging as if to reassure her the danger was gone. James sighed, a flicker of relief mixing with the weight of what was still to come. I'll be ready, James said, his voice resolute. Whatever it takes, I'll protect them. The sun dipped below the Kansas horizon, painting the wheat fields in shades of gold and crimson. The farmhouse stood quiet, its warm glow spilling through the windows onto the porch. Inside, A sense of calm had finally settled over the small family. James sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, while Sarah rocked Lily gently in her arms. Rex lay sprawled near the door, his head resting on his paws, his ears twitching occasionally at the distant sounds of the evening. It had been 2 weeks since Richard's failed confrontation. Sheriff Tucker and his team had assured Sarah that Richard's actions, combined with the illegal activities his men were linked to, would keep him tied up in legal battles for the foreseeable future. Tucker had also helped Sarah begin the process of filing for a restraining order and exploring options for full custody of Lily. For the first time in years, Sarah felt the faint stirrings of hope. James leaned back in his chair, watching Sarah as she hummed softly to Lily. There was a peacefulness about her now, a soft light that hadn't been there when she first arrived. The bruises on her arms had faded, and her nervous glances toward the windows had lessened. She was still cautious, still healing, but she was no longer running. "You're good with her," James said, breaking the quiet. His voice was low, almost tentative, as if he wasn't quite sure how to start the conversation. Sarah looked up, a small smile playing on her lips. "I've had to be," she replied. "She's the only thing that kept me going." James nodded, his gaze dropping to his coffee. He took a sip before speaking again. "What are you planning to do now?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sarah looked down at Lily, brushing her thumb gently over the baby's cheek. "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in a long time, I don't have to make a decision out of fear. But I don't want to uproot her again. She's safe here." James studied her for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You're welcome to stay," he said quietly. "As long as you need." Sarah's eyes met his, a flicker of surprise and gratitude in her expression. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "The place has been too quiet for too long, and Rex seems to have decided you belong here." At the sound of his name, Rex lifted his head, his tail thumping against the floor. Sarah laughed softly, the sound light and genuine. "He's the real boss around here, isn't he?" James chuckled. "Pretty much." For the first time in years, the farmhouse began to feel like a home again. Sarah took to helping James with the daily chores, from preparing meals to tending to the small vegetable garden Emily had once cherished. James, in turn, found himself growing more comfortable with the presence of Sarah and Lily. The sound of Lily's laughter filled the house, a sweet melody that brought life back to its empty rooms. One afternoon, as James and Sarah worked together to repair a section of the old barn fence, she paused, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I never thought I'd find a place like this," she said, her voice tinged with wonder. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere I could breathe." James looked at her, his expression softening. "This place has a way of doing that," he said. "It's why I stayed after Emily." Sarah hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "You loved her a lot, didn't you?" James nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "She was everything to me. Losing her, it broke something inside me. I thought the farm would be enough to keep me going, but for a long time, it just felt empty." Sarah stepped closer, her voice gentle. "It's not empty anymore." James met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. The farmhouse, the fields, the quiet rhythm of their days. It all felt different now. The pain of Emily's loss was still there, but it no longer consumed him. In its place was something new, something fragile but full of promise. That evening, as the sun set over the fields, James, Sarah, and Lily sat together on the porch. Rex lay at their feet, his head resting on James's boot. The air was filled with the scent of fresh-cut wheat and the distant hum of cicadas. It was a simple moment, but it felt monumental. James glanced at Sarah, who was holding Lily as she dozed off in her arms. "What do you think of Kansas so far?" he asked, a hint of teasing in his tone. Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening. "I think it's starting to feel like home." James nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Good," he said simply. For the first time in a long time, James allowed himself to believe that life could be more than just survival. It could be about rebuilding, about connection, about love in all its unexpected forms. The journey wasn't over, but for now, they had found their footing. Together, they were forging a new beginning, one that promised hope, healing, and the kind of peace that only the Kansas plains could provide. As the stars began to dot the sky, James leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. And for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's really exciting.